Today we are going to present you Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is a novel of manners, and we'll start with a brief presentation of what a novel of manners is about.
The novel of manners is a literary genre that deals with aspects of behavior, language, costumes, and values characteristic of a particular class of people in a specific historical context. The convention of the society dominate the story. Characters are differentiated by how they measure up to the uniform standard or ideal of behavior or fall below it. The novel of manners often shows a conflict between individual aspirations or ideal and the accepted social codes of behavior. There is a tight relationship between manners, social behavior, and character. Physical appearances are overall emphasized while manners and social behavior remain the main interests in the novel. The idea of manners has a social and also moral significance. Characters in the novel are not always morally and socially obliging to each other, but there is difference between the upstanding hero or heroine and the other socially less acceptable characters. Jane Austen's novels are the most important works in the genre, and thanks to her, the novel of manners is associated with her century, 19th century. Her works deal with the domestic affairs of English country gentry families of the 19th century and ignore elementary human tensions and larger social and political determinations. She concentrated her works on the lives, manners, and morals of the landed gentry who lives in small provincial villages and towns.
The story is set in the early 19th century England in a small country village in Hertfordshire near London. The main character is Elizabeth, the second of five sisters, Lydia, Mary, Kitty, Elizabeth and Jane, of the Bennet family, which lives in a modest social condition. One day, a rich, charismatic and sociable bachelor, Charles Bingley, and his best friend Fitzwilliam Darcy rent a fine house in the neighborhood. The Bennets meet them at the ball thrown by Sir Lucas, where Mr. Bingley falls in love with Jane, the eldest Bennet's daughter. Mrs. Bennet is overjoyed to hear the news, because she always wanted him to marry one of her daughters, since the second she met him. Also Mr. Darcy begins to feel attracted to Elizabeth, but he doesn't show it, because he disrespects her inferior social position, and also because he is very proud. Jane is in love with Bingley too, but because of her extremely shy nature, she confesses her happiness of having a relationship with Mr. Bingley only to Lizzie. Bingley's sisters disapproves their love story because she belongs to a lower social class, and one of them asks Darcy to introduce in order to separate the two lovers. So he tells Mr. Bingley to leave the area and to forget about Jane by convincing him that Jane doesn't love him. In the meantime, Mr. Collins courts Elizabeth, but she refuses his proposal. Then he decides to marry her best friend Charlotte, who accepts. During all this, Darcy falls in love with Elizabeth, and he asks her to marry him, not in particularly romantic way, because even in this situation his feeling of superiority and pride overtakes all his kind manners, and she rejects him, and she accuses him of separating her sister and Bingley. He writes a letter to her to explain the reason of his actions, and then Elizabeth, surprised, begins to change her feelings towards him. In summer, Elizabeth decides to go in Derbyshire near Darcy's house, and during the journey she meets him, and she observes that his behavior is changed for the better. Then Darcy, to prove her that he is actually changed, helps Elizabeth to find out her sister Lydia, who had escaped with Mr. Wickham, a young officer and a dishonest adventurer. Once returned home, Darcy provides for their marriage. After that, Elizabeth overcomes all her prejudices towards him, and she accepts the renewed proposal. Also Bingley comes back and becomes engaged to Jane, who is still in love with him. The novel ends happily with the double marriage of Elizabeth and Darcy and Jane and Bingley.
Now we move to the characters. Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth is the protagonist. She is the most intelligent and sensible of her five sisters. Elizabeth is well educated. She is not interested in wealth or titles. Good values and virtue are very important for her. Elizabeth's frankness causes her problems, and her initial prejudice against Darcy disappears when she realizes he is a good man. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Darcy is an extremely wealthy aristocrat. He is the master of Pemberley and the nephew of Lady Catherine. Mr. Darcy is intelligent and honest, but his excess of pride makes him believe to be superior and look down on his social inferiors. His arrogant ways make him unpopular, and they disgust people with which he has to do, but he is envied for his good looks and wealth. His sense of honor virtue helps him to control his pride after Elizabeth blames him for his narrow-minded perspective. Jane Bennet. Jane is the eldest and most beautiful Bennet sister. She is so gentle and amiable that she honestly and naively believes that everyone else in the world is the same. Moreover, the harmony between Jane and Bingley contrasts with the reciprocal aversion between Elizabeth and Darcy. Charles Bingley. Charles Bingley is Darcy's best friend. He is an amiable and good-tempered person like Jane, and even if he is very rich, he is not interested in class differences. Bingley is so modest to be swayed by the opinions of others. Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is the patriarch of the Bennet family, an intelligent gentleman with good sense. Living with Mrs. Bennet has made him rather bitter, and so he likes to irritate his wife, using his sarcastic and cynical sense of humor. Even if he loves his daughters, Mr. Bennet doesn't give his help in the matter of marriage. Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet is Mr. Bennet's wife. She is a foolish and frivolous woman. The aim in her life is to find a rich husband to her daughters, even if because of her unbecoming behavior, often the suitors of her daughters don't approve her. She is so superficial that she neglects to provide her daughters with a proper education. Her attitude embarrasses Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet. George Wickham. Wickham is an handsome fortune-hunting militia officer. Initially, Elizabeth is attracted by him, but then Darcy reveals her Wickham's true nature. He is self-interested, he is unloyal, he is slanderous. He marries Lydia only because Darcy gives him money. Lydia Bennet. Lydia is the youngest of the Bennet sisters. She is gossipy, immature, and flirtatious. She is a selfish person too because she gratifies her heavy caprice without considering the consequences. Differently from Elizabeth, she is obsessed with the regiment officers, and at the end she runs off with Wickham. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Darcy's aristocratic aunt and Mr. Collins's patroness. She is an arrogant and rich noblewoman who represents class snobbery, and she wants to separate the lower social class Elizabeth from her nephew. She is obsessed with flaunting her wealth and social superiority. She is a sharp-tongued woman, and she advises people without solicitation. Miss Bingley. Caroline Bingley is Bingley's youngest sister. She is a superficial and snobbish girl. She despises Elizabeth's lower social class origins, and she tries to garner Darcy's attention, but uselessly. On the contrary, Darcy is pushed to admire Elizabeth's self-possessed character even more. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is a distant cousin of the Bennet family who will inherit Mr. Bennet's property. He is a pompous and idiotic clergyman. As his status is so noble, he loves to tell everyone that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is his patroness. He is the worst combination of snobbish and obsequious, and for this reason he is ridiculous. The marriage with Charlotte Lucas doesn't change him. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife. The Gardiners are a lovely couple, and they have a very good relationship with their nieces, sometimes better than the Bennet sisters' parents. Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte is Elizabeth's best friend, the Bennet's neighbor. She is a pragmatic girl. Differently from Elizabeth, Charlotte doesn't believe love is the most important thing in a marriage. For this reason, when Mr. Collins proposes, she accepts. Having a comfortable home is more important than to be romantic. Mary Bennet. Mary is the middle Bennet sister. Mary is the girl the most cultured in the Bennet family. She is bookish and meticulous, and she dislikes going out into society and prefers to spend her time studying. In conversation, Mary often expresses very deep concepts and profound observations about human nature and life in general. Catherine Bennet. Catherine is the second youngest Bennet daughter, exhibits a little personality of her own. She tries to look like Lydia, and she is girlishly fascinated with the soldiers.
Now let's talk about the main themes of the novel. Even many critics, when they have to analyze the main themes of Pride and Prejudice, take the novel's title as a starting point, but one should not focus on it because Jane Austen here used again the formula of antithesis and alliteration, designed as a commercial factor, exactly as she did in her previous successful novel, which was entitled Sense and Sensibility. So after this clarification and moving to the major themes, we can say that they are often universal ideas explored in a literary work, such as class, wealth and social status, related to reputation, and a combination between love and marriage in terms of security. Plays a key role in the marriage market, not only for the young ladies desiring a rich husband, but also for men who wish to marry a woman of values. Much of the Pride and Prejudice in the novel exists because of class differences. In fact, Darcy cannot bring himself to love Elizabeth, or at least to admit his love for her even in his own heart, because of his pride. His first proposal clearly reflects this attitude. In fact, he says that he has hardly struggled to repress his feelings. Jane Austen seems to accept the existence of class divisions, but she also criticizes the way they can poison society. In fact, the novel criticizes an overemphasis on class, especially in terms of judging a person's character. But at the end, through the protagonists' overcoming of their prides and prejudices and the marriages of the two couples, Jane Austen shows the power of love and happiness, leaving behind class boundaries. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This is the opening sentence of the novel, and it gives us a complete idea of the marriage concept in society. It means that a single and rich man must need a wife. In fact, in want stands for necessary. In that period, a rich man could choose whichever girl he wanted, but options for girls were limited, based almost exclusively on their family's social rank and connections. The role of a mother, such as that of Mrs. Bennet, was to find a husband for each of her daughters and to marry them off as soon as possible, because women were not allowed to work, and marriage was the only way to attain wealth and an important social position. So mainly, marriages were something practical and economic rather than social activities. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance, says Charlotte, Elizabeth's friend, who marries Mr. Collins only because he can provide her a home and financial security. And Mr. Collins marries her after having been rejected by Elizabeth simply because he feels pressure from society which wants him to get married. Also, the marriage between Wickham and Lydia is a kind of contract because Wickham, who is an immoral guy and doesn't love Lydia, who is only 16, eloped with her, and these two had to get married. Lydia to save Bennet's reputation, and Wickham because he has been offered money to do so. The ideal could be Elizabeth, who refuses to trade her independence for financial comfort. In fact, she was supposed to marry Mr. Collins, her cousin, only because the Bennets didn't have a heir, and inheritance law dictated that in such cases the closest male cousin would inherit all family properties. And at the end, she marries her love, Darcy, making us realize that true love is a force separate from society and one that can conquer even the most difficult circumstances. Austen clearly leaves the reader with the impression that the two will be the happiest. Minor themes are self-awareness, virtue, reputation, courtship, environment and upbringing, individual versus society, and the idea of family.